Yeah.
Stellar Blade is uncensored in all regions worldwide. It's going international.
Technically, we are. You're right. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, and it's garnered a little bit of criticism. Well, not Stellar Blade, I should say. The censors have garnered a little bit of criticism, and this is because other games have not benefited from that same thing. So let's get into this. So basically, Stellar Blade has come out with a Zero D, if that's how you say it, CEROD rating in Japan, which means that it cannot be purchased by players unless they are under 17 years of age, unless they've got parental consent. So I suppose that's like a 17A. An adult's got to tell you that you can do it.
Yeah, I guess so.
I suppose. But that means that it can be released in Japan completely uncensored. They're going to leave everything in the game. Nothing's getting taken out. You just have to be over 17 or have an adult say that it's cool, which is surprising for Japan, maybe.
Yeah, especially given, and I'm learning some of this kind of on the fly as we investigate this story in particular, Japan's history of maybe being slightly less lenient when it comes to other countries and other content rating systems and organizations. I'm happy to go with Zero. That seems
Zero.
logical. The Computer Entertainment Rating Organization. I have no idea why the Japanese one is all English words, but there you go. There probably is. In fact, shall I try the Japanese version?
Oh, yes, please.
Because they've got like the Hepburn, which is when they spill it out in kind of like English. And so it's the Tokutai Hiri Katsudo Hojin Computer Entertainmento Retingo Kiko.
I can see why they go Zero.
Yeah, I can see that as well. But I do like that there were some words in there, kind of like Metaro Gear Sorido, where it's like, oh, that kind of just sounds like someone doing an unfortunate and potentially offensive impression. But actually, computer is actually, it's just the word. I'm not being racist, I promise.
I suppose if you literally don't have a word for something, then to just import a different word from a different language makes total sense. Like we do that with pajamas, right? That's not an English word. Isn't that Indian, I think, or something?
I can believe it.
I think shampoo is as well. Croissant.
Does that work?
Croissant's French.
Yeah.
Yeah, but we don't say it like a French person. We don't go like croissant.
Sometimes I do.
Maybe.
I get some weird looks every now and then when people ask me where I'm going on holiday, and I go, "I'm going to Paris."
Don't Americans say croissant? I think they pronounce the R as well. Croissant.
Stop! I'm gonna jump my croissant. Yeah, that sounds about right. I'm relying on my Vine memory there, but yes.
So the reason that Stellar Blade on the censors have had a little bit of a pushback on this is because often when a PlayStation game comes out, they have regional variations based on what the censors have said. And in this particular instance, the makers of Dead Space were pretty annoyed because when they tried to release the game in Japan, they were told that because of dismembered limbs and sort of general gruesomeness, they would not be allowed to release the game with the Zero D rating, and that in order to release the game at all, they would have to make cuts, they would have to make changes. And they've actually since Stellar Blade has come out, I believe it's the director of the. Sorry,
it was the EA Japan's general manager.
Thank you. My eyes are not working for me as I'm trying to figure. Oh yes, Sean Noguchi, who's gone on to X to complain and actually provide the receipts as well, because he's put up screenshots that show dismemberment, slices of body, and gruesomeness that is in Stellar Blade, which is exactly the content that they weren't allowed to have included in Dead Space. So a little bit of an unfair implementation of the rules, Jamie.
Yeah, a little bit of a double standard, because again, I don't know if this is kind of a funny quirk of something being directly translated, but there was a particular focus on what Sean kept referring to as the cross section, the idea that when something gets like sliced open or split open, and therefore you see kind of internal organs, or you might see exposed bones, things like that. That is clearly something that, or that is clearly the line where Japanese censors kind of, that's drawn for violence, in kind of, you either fall the right side of that or you fall the wrong side of it. And to be fair, on the evidence as presented, and sometimes we don't know what's going on the other side of these, within these censorship organizations. There have been entire documentaries made about certain Western ratings agencies and kind of how discreet and obscure they are, and how they never reveal their way of working, or who their members are completely anonymous. So it could be, I don't want to get into conspiracy theory territory, but it does appear to be a bit of a a double standard. The only thing that I can think to point to when it comes to kind of things I've looked at that are, I'm not going to call them research, then this isn't a kind of podcast that gets that we do any research for, but there may well be
Brutal.
Well, it's true. Like we sit.
No, I'm not calling you out or saying you're wrong. I'm just saying
we're two random people sitting down and talking about games. We don't need to do any homework.
Hello.
And to be fair, like I know, for example, I've read many BBFC kind of categorizations in the past, and that's the one that we have here in the UK. And they, for example, they're always quite keen to determine the sort of the tone, I guess, with which certain scenes of violence or action or even sex and drug use kind of take place within. And one thing that I feel like I'm seeing, and this is kind of backed up by the Dead Space situation, is that sort of very dark horror games seem to get treated slightly more harshly than perhaps other titles might be. The Callisto Protocol, for example, actually never even got released in Japan, as far as I can tell. They cancelled that game's release when it didn't receive a 0 rating due to the game's violent content, and the developer essentially refused to make the cuts that would have been necessary to get it one.
Right.
The Last of Us Part 2, another horror game of a sort, ended up getting a 0Z rating, which is the ages 18 and up only. It's the highest you can get while still being legal, and even that they had to make cuts to get it. So there is maybe an underlying element here where maybe they've seen some of the Stellar Blade content, whether it's the character design, enemy design, world design, or just general tone and themes of the game. They've looked at it and said, actually, they're slightly lighter, maybe more science fiction or science fantasy than survival horror, and that maybe has made them slightly more lenient. Or it could just be the case that this is like a weird, and it shouldn't be this way, but it could be a slightly more individual thing. Like you got the wrong sensor on the wrong day, and they didn't like what they saw. Oftentimes, you don't know whether these people are playing these games or whether they're being served pre-packaged and pre-edited sequences from these games that are supposed to represent the extremes of that violence. And in that case, it's like, what are the differences in these packages and who's making them? There are so many variables that it can be hard to call foul play off the bat. That being said, you do have to feel a little bit for Sean in this case where Zero pointed towards something that he can explicitly say is present in another title. And it's one of those things where I think there probably should be more onus on whether it's Zero or whether it's BBFC, PEGI, ESRB. There probably should be more of a process where they might have to defend their actions or explain. Complete sidetrack, but there's a huge conversation going on in England at the moment and around parts of Europe around like the quality of refereeing in football or soccer and the reliability and the consistency of VAR, which is the virtual assistant referee, and how easy it is theoretically for like the referees or the refereeing groups and organizations to kind of like basically scurry away after matches. Referees never do interviews. They're never held accountable. A referee has never been fired for what is theoretically poor job performance.
Right.
Sometimes organizations like these just kind of like they're a necessity, but that necessity is something that they can almost hide behind and never really have to answer for what might actually be errors in their working or inconsistencies in their determinations.
I think you make a good point. Because you can never actually know if you never know why they've made a decision. It's also got to be difficult when you're producing the content in the first place. You might be thinking, "Oh, we're gonna skip by this," and then you get caught up in some sort of classification, some sort of censorship that you didn't think you were going to fall under. I do have a quote here in from Sean who said, "Zero." So this is directed straight at them. "You said that our Dead Space was no good because the cross-section of damaged parts and internal organs were visible. But here you can see both the cross-sections and insides, so I'm not convinced you are using Zero D." I have a question based on that quote, though.
Yeah.
Do you think that maybe Zero are getting confused when they were looking at the game, and when they were looking at internal organs, they were just looking at the very, very tight, skimpy outfits that even her cohorts wear, and were getting confused?
I don't know. Maybe they were distracted by those tight outfits. Maybe they saw other appendages and didn't notice the exposed cross sections of some of Eve's enemies laying in the background.
Yeah, maybe they were looking really close and thinking, well, I can't see any of her internal
Yeah.
organs. I don't see what the problem is. And then, but it was all the scattered body parts that they were
But
supposed
also,
to be
like,
looking at.
you don't know who the person is. I can't remember what the name of it was, but I remember watching a documentary. I think it probably came out about 20 years ago. That was basically an investigation into the ratings agency for American motion pictures and trying to determine why they were so discreet and why their identities were hidden and why they never like had to justify their decisions. They just gave you a rating, and if you didn't like it, fuck it, you have to resubmit with a different cut, and that was end of conversation. And like one of the things in that documentary, and it could apply here to Zero or any agency that we're talking about, is like you also don't know who's on the other side. It could be someone like you or I who is tapped into the culture or the scene or the industry. It could very easily, though, much like when we talk about the people who are voting for Oscars, be someone who's 90 and has no idea what's going on and hasn't played a game for 17 years, and it's like, oh, what is this? Is this what the kids nowadays want? Tits and blood?
It couldn't be us. I mean, my brain, I'm so dead inside at this point that I could see almost anything and not, I'd put PG. PG, that's fine. And people would be horrified. Actually, talking PG, I actually had there's an interesting little tidbit. This is my one olive branch to Zero about the reason maybe that they've rated the two things differently, because recently I was reading an article about the UK BBFC, Jamie, as you were talking about, because they've actually recently changed the rating of the film Mary Poppins, a beloved children's film made in the 70s, I believe it was. The original, not the new one, which used to be a U. I was made in 1964, my mistake. It was originally a U for Universal in the UK, but it was recently regraded to be a PG. And that was because they've said... and they were actually being quite open and upfront and transparent about how they rate things and why they feel things are different. And what they basically said was times change, and actually things that were acceptable a few years ago or that we wouldn't consider something to push it into a higher category. Obviously, we expect that to move in one direction, right? We expect that things get more lenient, but actually some things don't. Some things move the other way. But yeah, so maybe there's a possibility that Zero D have tweaked their what they find acceptable in the modern day and age.
It's very totally possible, and it was also one of those things where, again, I'm not familiar enough of Zero and their processes to know how public that kind of documentation maybe is, for example. But like, yeah, maybe things have changed behind the scenes. Maybe kind of the line has moved slightly. Maybe that's communicated to developers. Maybe it's not. It's interesting. I occasionally get close to this side of things in my line of work. I've never been a part of the submission process or the approval process, but I've been a part of the trailer making process, in which you often have to be very careful about. For me, mostly working with Peggy and ESRB, and they have very specific rules about sort of where those logos or those icons are placed, whether at the beginning at their full screen or if they're in the corner, and how long they're on for, and having the Peggy 16 voice alongside it, things about how much of the screen it takes up and all that kind of, it's all very exacting. But every time I've done a trailer that is like for a Japanese version of a storefront, which is usually only really Nintendo, because Nintendo are the only ones where they have, in my experience, have different specifications for the eShop per continent, basically. Well, we do Europe, America, and Japan. Japan is the one where it's just unrated. We don't put the Zero on there or anything like that. Like, we only ever submit unrated, quote unquote, unrated trailers,
It's funny.
which is usually fine. And I think that's only not fine if your game is if your game is an adult game that has like a Peggy 18 or something like an equivalent of that. In that case, I think you have to have a full screen certificate at the beginning before the trailer starts, so people can't start accidentally watching something that they're not supposed to watch and then look at the icon in the corner to realize it gets weird.
It's interesting as well, because if you'd have asked me, I would have thought that Japanese horror is one of like the darkest and most terrifying horror
Right.
genres out there. Like, I mean, I always think of American version of Japanese horror films as being the more censored. They're sanitized in some way, and I don't think of Americans stuff as being particularly heavy on censorship when it comes to like gore and violence. So yeah, I'm actually quite surprised thinking about it that they've gone in this direction. But hey,
Can I ask you about your thoughts on a theory that's a little bit tinfoil hatty?
you can.
Okay.
Go for it.
So obviously, games that are released in Japan are subject to this process all the time. Every game that we've played this year, if it's been released in Japan, it went through this process, yeah? But we very rarely hear about a game, being kind of like censored or uncensored. And so in theory, like the official Stellar Blade account has gone out there and said, oh yeah, Stellar Blade is going to be uncensored in all countries, including the Japan version. Like no one else is doing that. Like again, it doesn't matter how adult. Like we could have been playing I've been playing like Rise of the Ronin recently. There's plenty of blood and plenty of gore in that, but like they didn't feel the need to tweet and go out. Yeah, it's uncensored in all countries. And even if you go and look at the tweet from the official Stellar Blade account, they put some really weird image with it with this big red cross that says uncensored all countries. Do you think there's a part of them that are using this announcement that is ostensibly just about, hey, the Japanese censors told us we didn't have to remove any violence, and using it to try and win internet brownie points with the people who are hoisting up Stellar Blade as like a victory for anti-DEI and like pro women with big tits and big like the whole crowd that are using Stellar Blade and Eve's character design as like a pushback and like a victory for the industry that is going in this horrible direction? Do you think they're kind of feeding into that shit show with a tweet like this that is ostensibly irrelevant to everyone in the West?
No.
Okay.
I think that's accurate, but for a different reason, and I think they're appealing to a different audience. I don't think they're appealing to the anti-DEI, the anti like that sort of crowd at all.
Yeah.
And maybe this is just me being filth. I think it's appealing to the crowd who like a bit of Japanese adult material, which you may know out there, you may have stumbled upon it, is censored and specifically pixelated in certain ways so that you can't see certain things. And actually finding uncensored content like that of a Japanese nature is more rare because they just don't make it right. It's because in order to produce adult content, they have to censor it. And the way that because I saw exactly the thumb you're talking about, and the way they've done that, I think what they're trying to angle for is almost
the mosaic.
Yes, I think they're maybe going for the idea of making in the back of because my mind went to this a little bit. It was like, what you've seen so far is the censored version of Stellar Blade, but we're allowed to put out the uncensored version of Stellar Blade. So I actually think it's a bit of a thirst trap.
Like our porn is censored, but our video games aren't.
Yes.
See the real uncut Stellar Blade.
See all of Eve. See all of Eve.
DVDs used to do that all the time. Like if there was even a remotely raunchy teen-oriented film, it would always come out and have its cinematic release, and the DVD would always be like the uncut or the unrated edition, which basically like there's 10 more seconds of tits in this one. Go and get your friends.
I think it's going after the thirst views, and I think they're using that conversation. I don't think it is. I don't have the feeling at all that it's, as you've said, it's that audience. I can see why people have said it, but to me that feeds into like a different mindset, and I don't think that's what they're doing. I think if they're going for either crowd, they're going for the Eve's sexy. You want to see her even less censored than you've seen her up to now. I think it's going for maybe that audience.
Still a big. See, it's a big audience. Why not? We're kind of a part of it. I like.
Me too. It's the Lara Croft swan diving into the water audience, and it's the Duke Nukem throwing money at the strippers in the club audience of video games. Which is, hey, we're all there for a bit of fun as we're playing apparently a very good video game.
You can have great gameplay and great eye candy at the same time.